Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the world grow quiet around you. Let the day you have lived settle gently behind you, like dust drifting down through still evening air. Loosen your shoulders. Let your jaw unclench and your hands fall open. Let your breathing slow and deepen and find its own soft rhythm. And let me carry you a very long way from here, further back than almost any story we have told together, more than 3,000 years into the past, to a warm and glittering world of golden palaces and painted ships that ringed the shores of an ancient sea, a whole brilliant civilization that flourished, and then, within the span of a single human lifetime, simply came apart and fell into darkness and was lost. Picture it now, in the warm light of a late afternoon, more than 3,000 years ago. You are standing on the stone quay of a great harbor on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. The water is a deep and endless blue, and it stretches away to a hazy horizon, and all across it move the ships, the broad wooden trading ships of the Bronze Age. Their single square sails filled with the afternoon wind, their hulls heavy with cargo from every corner of the known world. Behind you rises a rich and busy city, its streets climbing up the hillside, crowded with merchants and craftsmen and porters. And above it all, crowning the height, stands the palace, its walls painted in bright colors, its storerooms heavy with grain and oil and wine. Its scribes bent over their clay tablets, keeping careful account of all the wealth that flows in and out through this one small door onto the sea. And what wealth it is! On the quay before you, longshoremen are unloading a ship newly come to port, and you can see, stacked and waiting, the riches of a whole connected world. There are great ingots of copper, shaped like the hide of an ox, gleaming dully in the sun. There are heavy bars of tin, come from mountains so distant that no one in this city has ever seen them. Tin that will be mixed with the copper to make bronze, the metal that gives this whole age its name. There are jars of fragrant oil, and blocks of blue glass, and elephant tusks of ivory, and vessels of gold and silver, and rich purple cloth, and vessels of painted pottery from across the sea. Merchants haggle in 6 languages. A scribe records the cargo. And over all of it lies the warm confidence of a world at its height, a world of trade and plenty and peace, a world that has stood, it seems, forever, and that will surely stand forevermore. But it will not. Within a single generation, this harbor will be silent. This city will be a heap of ash and broken stone, and the whole shining world it belonged to will have vanished from the earth. Tonight, we are going to ask why. It is one of the greatest and most haunting mysteries in all of history, and one of the strangest. For at the end of the Bronze Age, a little more than 3,000 years ago, a whole interconnected civilization, the great and wealthy world of the Eastern Mediterranean, collapsed with astonishing speed and completeness. Mighty empires that had endured for centuries fell in a matter of years. Great cities that had stood for ages were burned to the ground and never rebuilt. The art of writing itself was lost across whole regions and would not return for hundreds of years. Trade routes that had bound the world together were severed. Kings and palaces and whole peoples simply vanished from the record. And when the dust settled, the survivors were left in a poorer, darker, smaller world. A long twilight that historians have sometimes called a dark age, in which so much was forgotten that later generations would remember the lost golden age only dimly, in myth and legend, as a vanished time of heroes. Tonight we will try to understand how such a thing could happen. We will first build up in our minds the brilliant world that fell, so that we may feel the weight of its falling, the great powers and their kings, the vast web of trade that bound them, the golden palaces and the busy harbors, and the sheer glittering interconnected richness of it all. And then we will watch it come apart. We will follow the first tremors of trouble, the letters begging for grain, the rumors of raiders upon the sea. We will meet the mysterious enemy that the ancient records call the Sea Peoples and try to learn who they were. We will feel the earth itself begin to shake, and the rains begin to fail, and the harvests begin to wither. And then, one by one, we will watch the great cities burn, and at the end, we will gather all the clues together and ask, as honestly as we can, the question that has puzzled scholars for a century and more. Why did the Bronze Age world collapse in a single generation? There is nothing you need to remember tonight. There will be no test in the morning. And nothing here you must carry with you into sleep. If your thoughts begin to drift and wander, let them drift. If sleep comes to gather you up before we reach the end of the story, then let it come, and welcome, for that is exactly what this quiet hour is for. The ancient ships will still be sailing in the dark, and I will still be here, telling their long story softly, whether you hear the end of it tonight or not. And if you find that these calm histories help to carry you down toward rest, you might gently tap the like button and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you and to others who lie awake in the dark and are looking for something quiet to hold on to. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now let the modern world dissolve entirely, and let us go back across more than 3,000 years, to that warm and golden world beside the ancient sea, in the last bright days before the fall. To understand the fall, we must first understand just how connected that world had become, for its connectedness is at the very heart of the mystery. We often imagine the ancient world as a scattering of isolated kingdoms, each shut away behind its own borders, knowing little of the lands beyond. But the world of the late Bronze Age, in the centuries before the collapse, was nothing like that. It was, in its own way, a world already global. A world knit together by trade and diplomacy and royal marriage into a single vast system that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan in the east to the shores of Greece and beyond in the west, from the deserts of Egypt in the south to the highlands of Anatolia in the north. Across all that vast expanse, the great kingdoms of the age were bound together in a web of connection, so dense, so busy, so mutually dependent, that a shock to any part of it could ripple outward to touch them all. At the center of this world stood a handful of great powers, mighty kingdoms and empires, that the historians sometimes call the Club of Great Kings, for their rulers wrote to one another as brothers, as equals, in a constant flow of royal letters carried back and forth across the ancient world. There was Egypt, richest and most ancient of them all, the land of the Nile, ruled by its pharaohs from their splendid cities in the south. A kingdom already old beyond reckoning, whose pyramids were, even then, ancient monuments of a distant past. There was the great empire of the Hittites, a formidable power that ruled from a mighty mountain capital in the highlands of Anatolia, in the land we now call Turkey, an empire of iron-willed warrior kings who for centuries were Egypt's chief rival for the mastery of the world. There were the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia, Babylon and Assyria, heirs to the oldest civilization on earth, keepers of a written wisdom that reached back thousands of years. And away to the west, across the sea, there were the Mycenaeans, the warlike, gold-loving Greeks of the Bronze Age, whose fortress palaces crowned the hills of Greece, and whose deeds, dimly remembered, would one day become the stuff of the great epic poems of Homer. Between these great powers, and bound to them, lay a host of smaller kingdoms and wealthy trading cities, and these were in many ways the beating heart of the whole system. The island of Cyprus, rich in copper, was a great hub of trade. The cities of the Levantine coast, the narrow strip of land along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, were bustling ports where the goods of 3 continents changed hands. There were merchant cities whose whole life was trade, whose harbors were forests of masts, whose warehouses were stuffed with the wealth of the world. And through all of them flowed the great currents of Bronze Age commerce, the ships laden with copper and tin and gold and oil and grain and timber and cloth and glass and ivory, moving ceaselessly from port to port around the rim of that ancient sea. And it was not only goods that flowed along these routes, but words and ideas and people. The great kings wrote constantly to one another, and many of their letters have survived, baked into clay, and they give us an astonishing window into that connected world. They address one another as my brother. They exchange lavish gifts, gold from Egypt, fine horses, precious lapis lazuli, skilled craftsmen, physicians. They arrange marriages between their royal houses, sending princesses across vast distances to seal alliances. They complain, they bargain, they flatter, they make demands. One king writes to another begging for more gold, insisting that in his brother's land gold is as common as dust. Another frets over the terms of a marriage. They squabble like the members of any great family, but they are a family, a single connected community of powers, aware of one another, dependent on one another, tangled together in 100 ways. To feel the texture of that connected world, consider what it meant to seal an alliance in those days. When two great kings wished to bind their houses together, a princess of one royal family would be sent, across hundreds or thousands of miles, to marry the king of another. And the journey of such a bride was itself a great event of state, a caravan of attendants and gifts and dowry winding its way across the ancient world, from one court to another, carrying with it not only a woman, but a whole web of obligation and connection. The letters fret over every detail of such matches, the size of the dowry, the honor to be shown to the bride, the gifts to be exchanged, the anxieties of a father sending his daughter to a distant land, and the gifts that flowed alongside these marriages and along the ordinary channels of royal friendship were lavish beyond imagining. Chariots and horses, vessels of gold and silver, precious stones, fine garments, rare oils and perfumes, skilled physicians and craftsmen lent from one court to another. Whole inventories of treasure carefully listed in the letters, each king striving to outdo the others in the splendor of his generosity, and each keeping a sharp and jealous account of what he had sent and what he had received in return. It was a world in which the great powers were bound together, not only by trade and treaty, but by a constant, glittering exchange of wealth and people and courtesy, a dense and living web of relationship stretching across the whole known world, so that the doings of a king in one land were followed with keen interest in the courts of half a dozen others, and no great power stood truly alone. This was the world of the late Bronze Age at its height, not a scattering of isolated realms, but a single, brilliant, interconnected civilization, spanning much of the known world, richer and more closely bound together than anything that had ever existed before. And that, as we shall see, was both the source of its glory and the secret of its doom. At the very foundation of this whole glittering world lay a single, humble, all-important thing: metal. It is called the Bronze Age for a reason, and to understand the age and its fall, we must understand its metal. Bronze was the wonder material of that world, the substance from which its finest tools and weapons were made. A bronze blade held an edge far better than anything of stone or copper alone. A bronze plow, a bronze axe, a bronze sword, a bronze suit of armor. These were the things that separated a rich and powerful society from a poor and weak one. Whoever had bronze, and plenty of it, had the means to farm well, to build well, and above all to fight well. Bronze was, in a very real sense, the source of power in that world. But here is the crucial thing, the thing that made the Bronze Age world so fragile without anyone quite realizing it. Bronze is not a metal that can simply be dug out of the ground. It is a mixture, an alloy, made by combining two different metals: copper, which was relatively common and could be found in many places, and tin, which was rare and precious and found only in a very few, very distant places. To make bronze, you needed both. And while copper was mined on Cyprus and in other places around the Mediterranean, tin, the essential second ingredient, had to be carried in from far, far away, from sources so remote that the people who used the tin often had no idea where it truly came from. Some of it, it seems, came from the distant mountains of Central Asia, thousands of miles to the east, passed from hand to hand along vast trade routes. Some may have come from as far away as the tin-rich lands of the distant west, at the very edge of the known world. Think for a moment about what this meant. Every bronze sword in the hand of a Mycenaean warrior, every bronze tool on an Egyptian farm, every bronze vessel in a Hittite palace depended on a thin, precious trickle of tin flowing in from the far ends of the earth, along trade routes thousands of miles long, passing through the hands of countless middlemen, across mountains and deserts and seas. The entire military and economic power of these great civilizations rested, ultimately, upon their ability to keep that trickle of tin flowing, and that made them dependent, deeply and dangerously dependent, upon the smooth functioning of a vast and complicated trade network that stretched far beyond the borders of any one of them. A network that no single king controlled, and that could be disrupted at many points along its enormous length. So long as the trade flowed, all was well, and bronze was plentiful, and the great powers flourished. But if the trade should ever fail, if the long routes should ever be cut, then the whole system would be starved of the very metal on which its power depended. It was a hidden weakness at the heart of a mighty world, and few, if any, seem to have understood how dangerous it was. We can see this connected world of trade with our own eyes, in a way, thanks to one of the most remarkable discoveries in all of archaeology, a single Bronze Age merchant ship that sank, more than 3,000 years ago, off the coast of what is now Turkey, and lay undisturbed on the seabed until divers found it in modern times. When they explored the wreck, they found the whole connected world preserved in a single cargo. There were 10 tons of copper in those distinctive ox-hide ingots, enough to make a great mass of bronze. There was a ton of tin, the precious partner metal, come from who knows how far. There was raw glass in deep blue discs, and logs of fragrant wood, and elephant tusks, and hippopotamus teeth for ivory, and jars of resin, and ostrich eggshells, and jewelry of gold, and tools and weapons, and pottery, and beads. The goods of at least 7 or 8 different cultures, all gathered into the hold of one ship, moving from port to port around the rim of the sea. It is a snapshot, frozen in time, of the astonishing reach and richness of Bronze Age trade. A single sunken ship that carried, in its belly, the tangled threads of a whole connected world. And it reminds us, more vividly than any list of kings, just how bound together that world truly was, and just how much depended on the ships that carried its lifeblood back and forth across the water. There was another kind of fragility hidden within the Bronze Age world, and it lay not in the trade routes but in the very way its societies were organized, in the great palaces that stood at the heart of every kingdom and every city. For the Bronze Age was, above all, an age of palaces, and the palace was far more than the home of a king. It was the central engine of the whole society, the hub around which everything turned. Imagine one of these great palaces, its storerooms lined with hundreds of enormous clay jars filled with grain and oil and wine, its workshops busy with weavers and potters and metal workers and perfume makers, its courtyards crowded with officials and scribes and soldiers and servants. The palace gathered in the produce of the whole surrounding land, the grain from the fields, the wool from the flocks, the goods of the craftsmen, and it stored them, and it kept careful account of them, and then it redistributed them, doling out rations to the workers, supplies to the soldiers, materials to the craftsmen, gifts to the allies, according to the careful reckoning of its scribes. This was what historians call a redistributive economy, and it was a marvel of organization, but it was also, in its way, terribly fragile. For everything depended on the center. The ordinary farmer and craftsman did not trade freely in a bustling marketplace of their own. They brought their goods to the palace, and received back what the palace gave them. The whole complex machinery of production and distribution was managed from the top, by the palace and its scribes, in a great centralized system that reached into every corner of economic life. And this meant that the society was only as strong as its palace. So long as the palace stood, and its scribes kept their accounts, and its storerooms were full, The system worked, and worked beautifully, feeding thousands, supplying armies, sustaining a rich and ordered life. But if the palace should fall, if the center should fail, then there was nothing to take its place. There was no independent network of merchants and markets that could carry on without it, no other structure to hold society together. Knock out the palace, and you knocked out the very heart of the society, and everything that depended on it would fail at once. We know a great deal about how these palaces worked because of the records their scribes kept, records that have survived in a most unexpected way. In the Mycenaean world of Bronze Age Greece, the palace scribes wrote their accounts on tablets of soft clay, in an early form of writing that we call Linear B, a script used almost entirely for the bookkeeping of the palace. Lists of grain and livestock, inventories of weapons and chariots, rosters of workers, records of offerings to the gods. These clay tablets were never meant to last. They were working documents, to be kept for a year and then discarded. And the clay was left soft and unbaked. And yet thousands of them have survived, down to our own day, and the reason they survived is a chilling one. They survived because they were baked hard, accidentally, in the very fires that destroyed the palaces. When a Mycenaean palace burned, the flames that consumed it also fired the soft clay tablets in its archives, turning them to hard, durable pottery, and preserving them for 3,000 years. The records of these societies come to us, quite literally, out of the ashes of their destruction, hardened in the flames that ended the world they described. There is something deeply haunting in that we can read the careful, ordinary, everyday accounts of these palaces, the tallies of sheep and jars of oil, only because those palaces were burned, and the fire that destroyed them also, by chance, saved the record of what they had been. So this was the world of the late Bronze Age, a world of great connected powers, bound together by a vast web of trade, a world dependent, for its very lifeblood, on the long-distance flow of precious metals along fragile routes, and a world organized around great central palaces, magnificent but brittle, in which the failure of the center could bring down everything. It was a brilliant world, a rich world, a world at the very height of its achievement. And it was, though no one could see it, a world balanced on a knife's edge, held up by 100 delicate threads, any one of which, if cut, might set the whole thing swaying, and several of which, if cut at once, might bring the whole magnificent structure crashing down. Let us walk, for a little while, through that world at its height, and see its great cities as they were in their golden days, before the darkness came, so that we may hold them clearly in our minds. Come first to the land of Greece, to the fortress city of the Mycenaeans, crowning a rocky height above the plain. Its walls are built of stones so vast that later ages, unable to believe that mere men had raised them, would say they must have been the work of giants. You pass through a mighty gateway, crowned with the carved figures of 2 great lionesses, and climb into the citadel, past the shaft graves where the warrior kings of old lie, buried under masks of beaten gold, and up to the palace at the summit, its great hall bright with painted walls, its hearth blazing, its lord seated in state among his warriors, gold-hilted swords at their sides, drinking from cups of gold. This is a hard, proud, warlike world, a world of raiders and heroes and treasure, the world that would one day be remembered, dimly and gloriously, in the tales of the Trojan War. Cross now to the east, to the highlands of Anatolia, to the great capital of the Hittite kings, a mighty city ringed by miles of massive stone walls, guarded by gates carved with lions and sphinxes and armored gods. Within stand the temples of 1,000 gods, and the vast palace of the king, and the great archive, where the scribes keep the records of the empire on thousands of clay tablets, in many languages. Treaties and letters and laws and prayers, the accumulated wisdom and business of a superpower. From this mountain fastness the Hittite kings rule a broad empire and treat as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt themselves, and come, finally, to the richest of them all, to Egypt, ancient and golden, along the green ribbon of the Nile. Here the pharaoh reigns in a splendor that dwarfs all the rest. in vast temples of towering stone columns, their walls covered in painted carvings, their sanctuaries heavy with gold. Here monuments already ancient beyond memory rise from the desert sands, and a civilization thousands of years old rolls on in stately, unhurried grandeur, seemingly eternal, seemingly beyond the reach of any harm. Egypt is the fixed point, the immovable center, the land that has always been, and that surely always will be. These great powers had risen, over the centuries, to a height of wealth and confidence perhaps never before seen in the world, and by around the time we would number as 1,250 years before the Common Era, they stood at the very summit of their glory. Egypt and the Hittites, the two greatest rivals, had fought a tremendous battle a generation or so before, a vast clash of chariots at a place called Kadesh, in which the young pharaoh Ramesses had very nearly been killed, and which each side, in the end, claimed as a victory. But out of that terrible battle had come something remarkable, a lasting peace. The two great empires, weary of their long struggle, had made a formal treaty, one of the first great peace treaties in all of recorded history, sworn before the gods, sealing an alliance between them, even joined by a royal marriage. And so, in the golden years, the two superpowers of the age were at peace, and the trade routes were open, and the harvests were good, and the ships sailed freely, and the palaces were full. And to any observer of the time it must have seemed that this rich, connected, orderly world was as solid and as permanent as the pyramids themselves. There was no enemy on the horizon great enough to threaten it. There was no rival power rising to overthrow it. There was only prosperity, and peace, and the endless comfortable hum of a great civilization going about its business, as it always had, and as it surely always would. And then, quietly at first, and then with terrible speed, it all began to fall apart. The first signs of trouble, when we look back for them now, were quiet ones, easy to miss, the kind of thing that seems unremarkable at the time and only later, in hindsight, takes on a darker meaning. They come to us, many of them, in the letters, the royal and official correspondence that flowed across the Bronze Age world and that has survived, here and there, baked into clay. And running through these late letters, in the final decades before the collapse, there is a growing note of anxiety, a sense of a world beginning to strain and fray at its edges. Again and again, in these last years, the letters speak of hunger. There are messages about grain, urgent messages, kings writing to kings to beg for shipments of grain, to arrange the transport of food across the sea, to plead that the grain be sent quickly, for it is, they say, a matter of life and death. The great Hittite Empire, that mighty mountain power, appears in these late years to have been struggling to feed itself, sending desperate requests for grain to be shipped in from other lands, from Egypt and from the cities of the Levantine coast. One letter speaks of a matter of life and death, of a people who will not survive without the food that is being requested. Something was going wrong with the harvests, it seems, some deep and persistent failure of the land to yield enough to feed the people. And the great powers were reaching out across the sea to one another for help, leaning on the connected trade network to move food from where there was plenty to where there was famine. And there were other worries, too, creeping into the correspondence. There are letters that speak of enemies upon the sea, of ships appearing off the coasts, of raiders. One king writes anxiously to another about hostile ships that have been sighted, asking for warships to be sent, warning of danger from the water. There are hints of unrest, of towns under threat, of a growing insecurity along the coasts and the trade routes. The smooth and confident hum of the great connected world was, in these late years, beginning to be disturbed by a rising undertone of fear. A sense that the seas were no longer entirely safe, that the harvests were no longer entirely reliable, that something, somewhere, was beginning to go wrong. Taken one at a time, none of these things would have seemed like the end of the world. A bad harvest, a request for grain, a rumor of pirates, these were ordinary troubles, the sort of thing that any age must face and weather. The great kings had dealt with such difficulties many times before, and no doubt they expected to deal with these as well, to send the grain, to dispatch the warships, to ride out the bad years until the good years returned, as they always had. There is no sign, in these late letters, that anyone understood what was coming. There is no sense of a civilization bracing itself for its own destruction. There is only the ordinary business of governance, the ordinary management of ordinary troubles, carried on with the ordinary confidence of people who have every reason to believe that their world will go on. But the troubles this time did not pass. They deepened and multiplied and began to feed upon one another. The bad harvests did not give way to good ones. The rumors of raiders did not fade, but grew, until the raiders themselves came out of the haze of rumor and into the terrible light of history. And it is to them, to the great and mysterious enemy that the ancient records call the Sea Peoples, that we must now turn. And there are signs, too, that in these last uneasy years the great cities themselves sensed that something was coming, and began, quietly and desperately, to prepare for it. When we look closely at the archaeology of the final Bronze Age, we find, in city after city, evidence of a sudden concern with defense, a scramble to strengthen walls and secure supplies, as though a whole world had begun, all at once, to feel afraid. In the fortress citadels of Mycenaean Greece, in these last years, we find great new works of fortification being hurried into place, walls thickened and heightened, gates narrowed and strengthened. And most telling of all, at more than one of these fortresses, the people undertook an enormous labor to secure their water. They dug deep, hidden passages down through the rock, secret stairways descending far below the citadel to underground springs and cisterns, so that even if the fortress were besieged and cut off, its defenders could still reach water and hold out. These were vast undertakings, the work of many hands over a long time, and people do not go to such lengths, do not tunnel down through solid rock to hide their water away, unless they are very much afraid, unless they expect and dread a coming time of siege and danger. Picture that, for a moment, a whole world, sensing the approach of some great and nameless threat, fortifying itself against a doom it could not clearly see. The people of these citadels did not know, perhaps, exactly what was coming, whether raiders or famine or war, but they knew that the safe and easy days were ending, that the seas were no longer friendly, that danger was drawing near. And so they dug, and they built, and they braced themselves, hauling stone and cutting rock, securing their strongholds against the gathering dark. There is something deeply poignant in the thought of it, in these desperate, determined preparations, this refusal to go down without a fight. And there is something tragic in it, too, for in the end, for all their labor, most of these preparations failed. The walls they raised so hurriedly were breached or abandoned. The water they hid so cleverly did not save them. The great fortresses fell anyway, one after another, their deep cisterns and their thickened walls availing them nothing against the storm that came. But the effort remains, written in the stone, a mute and moving testimony to a people who saw the darkness coming, and did everything they could to hold it back, and who deserve to be remembered at least for that. The Sea Peoples are one of the great enigmas of ancient history, a name that carries with it a whiff of terror and mystery even now, 3,000 years later. We know of them chiefly from the records of Egypt, the one great power that survived the collapse and lived to write about it, and in those records they appear as a vast and fearsome tide of enemies, coming out of the north and the sea, sweeping down upon the civilized world in wave after wave, burning and destroying as they came. The Egyptians did not fully understand who they were or where they had come from, and neither, in truth, do we, even now. They called them, among other names, the peoples of the sea, the foreigners from the northern lands, and they recorded their coming as one of the great crises in the history of Egypt. The first great wave came in the reign of a pharaoh named Merneptah, some years before the final collapse. A great host of enemies, including peoples with strange names that the Egyptians carefully recorded, came against Egypt from the west, allied with the Libyans of the desert, and Merneptah met them in a great battle and, he tells us, defeated them, driving them back and slaying them in their thousands. It was a mighty victory, celebrated in stone, and for a time the danger seemed to have passed. But it had not passed. It had only paused. And a generation or so later, in the reign of the pharaoh Ramesses III, the sea peoples came again, and this time they came not as a mere raid, but as a migration, a vast movement of whole peoples, an overwhelming flood. The account that Ramesses III left of this second great invasion, carved upon the walls of his great temple, is one of the most vivid and terrible documents to survive from the ancient world. He describes how the sea peoples came, a great confederation of northern folk, and how no land could stand before them. He tells how they swept down through the lands to the north of Egypt, and how, one after another, the great kingdoms and cities fell before them, cut off and destroyed, wiped away as if they had never been. The mighty Hittite Empire, he says, was among those that fell, and the lands and islands of the north, and city after city along the coast, all of them consumed in the advance of this terrible host. And the enemy, he says, came on toward Egypt itself, their coming prepared, their confederation united. A great mass of peoples moving with their warriors and their ships, and, most tellingly of all, with their ox carts piled high with their women and their children and their household goods. For this was no army out for plunder that meant to go home again. This was a people on the move, carrying everything they owned, seeking not treasure, but a new land to settle in. Driven from wherever they had come from by some force we cannot see, and falling now upon the rich and ordered world of the south like a flood upon a valley. Ramesses III tells how he prepared to meet them, how he set his defenses in order and gathered his forces on land and sea, and how at last he fought the great invaders in two tremendous battles, one on land and one on the water, at the very edge of Egypt. On the reliefs at his temple, we can still see the great sea battle depicted, a chaos of ships and drowning men. The Egyptian archers pouring their arrows into the enemy vessels, the strange northern warriors with their feathered headdresses and their horned helmets falling into the sea. And Ramesses claims a great victory. He tells us that he shattered the sea peoples, that he threw them back from the borders of Egypt, that he saved his land from the fate that had swallowed so many others. And it seems that, in this at least, he told the truth, for Egypt did survive, when so much else did not. But it was a victory won at the very brink of disaster. And it was, in a sense, the last great act of the old Bronze Age world, the final stand of a dying age. For all around Egypt, in every direction, the rest of that brilliant connected world was, in these very years, going down into fire and darkness, and not even Egypt, though it survived, would ever be the same again. But who were they? These sea peoples who came so suddenly out of the north, and the sea to overwhelm a world. This is one of the deepest and most debated questions in all of ancient history, and the honest answer is that we do not truly know. The Egyptian records give us a list of names, the names of the various peoples who made up the Great Confederation, and scholars have puzzled over these names for a century and more, trying to match them to places and peoples we can recognize. Some of the names seem to point toward the lands and islands of the Aegean, toward Greece and the coasts of Anatolia, and the great islands of the eastern Mediterranean. Others have been linked, more speculatively, to lands as far away as Italy and Sicily and Sardinia. One of the named peoples, the ones the Egyptians called the Peliset, is generally thought to be the people we know from the Bible as the Philistines, who, after the great battle, settled along the coast of the land that would take from them the name of Palestine, and who appear in the ancient scriptures as the great enemies of the early Israelites. So at least one branch of the sea peoples we can follow, a little way, into the pages of later history. But beyond a few such threads, the sea peoples remain shrouded in mystery. We do not know for certain where they came from, or what set them in motion, or why they came when they did. And this uncertainty points us toward a deeper and more unsettling possibility, one that has come in recent times to change the whole way we think about the collapse. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were cast as the great villains of the story, the barbarian horde that came out of nowhere, and by sheer force of arms, smashed the civilized world to pieces. It was a simple and satisfying explanation. The Bronze Age fell because it was invaded and destroyed by these terrible raiders from the sea. But the more we have studied the matter, the more that simple story has begun to come apart, and the Sea Peoples have begun to look less like the cause of the collapse and more like one of its symptoms. For consider, where did the Sea Peoples come from? They came, it seems, largely from within the Bronze Age world itself, or from its edges, from the very lands that were collapsing. They came carrying their families and their possessions, seeking new homes, driven from their old ones. That is not the behavior of a conquering empire flush with strength. It is the behavior of refugees, of desperate peoples fleeing some disaster in their own lands, some famine or ruin or upheaval that had already destroyed the world they came from, and had set them wandering in search of somewhere, anywhere, to survive. The Sea Peoples, in other words, may not have been the ones who first broke the Bronze Age world. They may have been among its first victims, peoples already uprooted and ruined by whatever deeper catastrophe was unfolding, who then, in their desperation, became a force of destruction in their turn, falling upon lands that were themselves already weakened and reeling. The Great Invasion, then, may have been not the disease but a symptom of the disease, one wave in a much larger storm, a great churning of displaced and desperate peoples set in motion by some deeper cause that we have yet to name. And so, to find the true origins of the collapse, we must look past the Sea Peoples, dramatic and terrible as they were, and search for the hidden forces that may have set the whole terrible chain of events in motion. We must look to the earth itself, and to the sky, and to the deep and quiet catastrophes that leave no armies on the temple walls, but that can bring a world to its knees, all the same. But before we search for those hidden forces, let us pause and feel the weight of the destruction itself, for it was very real and very terrible, and it left its mark in the earth in a way that the archaeologist's spade can still uncover today. All across the eastern Mediterranean, when we dig down into the ruins of the great Bronze Age cities, we find, again and again, the same thing: a layer of destruction, a stratum of ash and burnt debris and collapsed walls, marking the moment when the city was violently destroyed, and above it, very often, nothing at all, or only the poor and scattered remains of a diminished people camping in the ruins of a greatness they could no longer match. City after city, from Greece to the coast of the Levant, bears this same scar, this same black line of burning in the earth, all of it dating to that same terrible span of years around the collapse. It was not one city that fell, or two, or a dozen. It was very nearly all of them, across a vast region, in a single dreadful generation. Of all these fallen cities, none speaks to us more hauntingly than the great merchant city of Ugarit, on the coast of what is now Syria, a rich and cosmopolitan port that was one of the busiest trading hubs of the entire Bronze Age world. Ugarit was a city of merchants and scribes, and its ruins have yielded a great archive of clay tablets that tell us much about the connected world of its day. And among these tablets are some that appear to date from the very last days of the city, from the final moments before its destruction. And they are among the most chilling documents to survive from all of antiquity. In one of them, the king of Ugarit writes desperately to a neighboring king, describing his plight. "The enemy ships," he says, "have come. They have burned his towns and done terrible things in his land. His own forces," he explains, "are away, his army in one distant land, and his fleet in another. And so the city lies undefended, exposed, at the mercy of the enemy upon the sea. Do you not know," he asks, "that all my troops are gone? The land is abandoned to itself." And then the record falls silent. For the truly haunting thing about these last letters of Ugarit is where they were found. Some of them were discovered in a kiln, an oven for baking clay tablets, where they had been placed to be hardened, and where they still lay, baked but never sent, when the archaeologists uncovered them 3,000 years later. The letters describing the coming of the enemy, the desperate pleas for help, were still sitting in the oven where they had been left to bake, waiting to be carried to their destinations. When the catastrophe fell, and the city was destroyed, and everyone in it was killed or scattered, and there was no one left to take the letters out of the kiln and send them on their way. The final cries for help of a dying city, frozen in the very act of being written and prepared, buried in the ashes of the city's fall, and read at last, for the first time, by strangers 3,000 years after the hands that wrote them had turned to dust. Ugarit was destroyed, and it was never rebuilt. The great and wealthy port, hub of a connected world, simply ceased to exist, and its people vanished from history, leaving behind only the ashes and the silent, unsent letters in the oven. And Ugarit was only one among many. Far to the north, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, that great mountain fortress ringed with miles of stone walls, was abandoned and burned. And the empire it had ruled for centuries simply dissolved, its royal line ending, its records ceasing, its power gone as though it had never been. Across the sea in Greece, the fortress palaces of the Mycenaeans went up in flames. One after another, their great halls burned, their painted walls blackened, their storerooms consumed. And among the ashes of one of them, at Pylos, the clay tablets baked hard in the fire recorded, in their final entries, urgent measures for defense. Watchers being posted along the coast to guard against a threat from the sea, the last anxious preparations of a doomed people, preserved forever in the flames that consumed them. Everywhere, the same story: the fire, the fall, the silence. The great cities of the Bronze Age world, the palaces and the ports and the fortresses, the centers of that whole brilliant civilization, were being destroyed, one after another, in a wave of catastrophe that swept across the entire region and left, in its wake, only ashes and ruins, and the long silence of a world that had died. What could have done this? What force, or forces, could have brought down so much, so quickly, across so vast an area? For a century, scholars have searched for the answer, and they have proposed many theories, each capturing some part of the truth, and we will consider them now one by one, like clues gathered at the scene of some vast and ancient crime. And the first suspect we must consider is the earth itself. The eastern Mediterranean is a restless land, a place where the great plates of the earth's crust grind against one another, and it is prone to earthquakes, sometimes terrible ones. And when archaeologists have examined the ruins of the fallen Bronze Age cities, they have found in many of them signs that suggest earthquakes played a part in the destruction. Walls collapsed in ways that fire and war do not explain. Columns toppled all in the same direction. Bodies of people crushed beneath fallen masonry, caught and killed by the sudden collapse of buildings. And here is the striking thing. It appears that a whole series of great earthquakes may have struck the region within a relatively short span of time. Around the period of the collapse, a cluster of seismic catastrophes that some scholars have called an earthquake storm. For earthquakes, along a connected system of faults, can come in sequences, one great quake shifting the stresses in the earth and triggering others, up and down the fault lines, over a span of years or decades. And it may be that just such a storm of earthquakes shook the Bronze Age world in its final years, toppling its walls, wrecking its palaces, and shattering the confidence of its people. We can imagine what such a thing would have meant. A great city, its mighty walls thrown down in an instant, its palace cracked and ruined, its people crushed or terrified, its stores buried in rubble, its defenses broken open just as the raiders were beginning to prowl the seas. An earthquake does not only kill and destroy in the moment, it leaves a society weakened, its walls breached, its order disrupted, its resources strained by the need to rebuild, far more vulnerable to whatever other troubles might come. A city shattered by an earthquake would be an easy prey for raiders, unable to defend its broken walls. A kingdom struggling to recover from one disaster would have little strength left to face another. And yet, for all this, the earthquakes cannot be the whole answer. Earthquakes, however terrible, are nothing new in that part of the world. Cities had been shaken and rebuilt many times before, over the long centuries of the Bronze Age, without the whole civilization coming to an end. A city knocked down by an earthquake is, in normal times, simply rebuilt. As cities in that region had always been rebuilt after such disasters, for the earthquakes to have played their part in the Great Collapse, there must have been something else, some other set of pressures already bearing down upon that world, so that when the earth shook, the cities did not rise again, because the strength and the will and the resources to rebuild them were no longer there. The earthquakes, then, were most likely not the sole cause, but one blow among several, one weight added to a load that was already becoming too heavy to bear. To find the other weights, we must lift our eyes from the trembling earth to the silent sky, and consider an enemy that carved no reliefs on any temple wall and burned no cities, and yet may have done more than any army to bring the Bronze Age world to its knees: the slow, patient, merciless enemy of drought. Of all the theories that seek to explain the fall of the Bronze Age world, none has grown stronger in recent years than the theory of drought, of a great and prolonged failure of the rains, a climate catastrophe that struck the eastern Mediterranean in the very years of the collapse, and choked the life out of its civilizations from below. For a long time this was only a suspicion, drawn from those anxious letters begging for grain, those hints of famine in the final years. But in our own age, science has given us new ways of listening to the ancient climate, ways of reading the record of the vanished weather written in the earth itself. And what that record tells us is sobering indeed. Scientists can study the climate of the distant past in many ways. They can drill down into the beds of ancient lakes and take out long cores of mud, layer upon layer, and in those layers, they can read the pollen of the plants that grew around the lake in each ancient year, and so tell whether the land was green and well-watered or dry and barren. They can study the chemistry of ancient sediments and the growth rings of long-dead trees, and the deposits in caves, all of which preserve, in their own ways, a record of the rainfall and the temperature of ages long past. And when they have turned these methods upon the eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age, the evidence has pointed, more and more clearly, in one direction toward a severe and lasting drought, a period of years, perhaps of decades, in which the rains failed, and the land dried, and the harvests withered, across much of the region, in the very generation of the collapse. Imagine what such a drought would mean for that world. The great palace economies depended, utterly, on the harvest, on the grain that filled their storerooms, and fed their people, and their armies, and their craftsmen. Let the rains fail for a year, and the stores would grow thin. Let them fail for several years running, and famine would stalk the land. Let them fail for a decade, and the whole foundation of the society would begin to crumble. The people would grow hungry, and then desperate. The palace would be unable to feed its dependents, unable to maintain its workers and its soldiers, unable to keep the great machine of redistribution turning. Hunger would drive people from their homes, set them wandering in search of food, turn ordered subjects into desperate refugees, and desperate refugees into raiders. And here, perhaps, we find the hidden force that set the sea peoples in motion, the deep cause behind the great migration, not some sudden barbarian ambition, but the slow, grinding pressure of a failing climate, driving whole peoples from lands that could no longer feed them, sending them out across the sea in search of somewhere they might live. A drought is a quiet catastrophe. It carves no reliefs. It leaves no dramatic layer of ash. It kills not in a single night of fire, but slowly, over seasons and years, through the emptying of the storerooms and the swelling of the graves. It is the kind of disaster that leaves little trace in the proud records of kings, who preferred to carve their victories in stone rather than confess that their people were starving. And yet, it may have been the deadliest enemy of all, the invisible hand that weakened every kingdom at once, that emptied the granaries, and set the peoples wandering, and turned a connected, prosperous world into a landscape of hunger and desperation, ripe for collapse. And notice, too, how a great drought would strike not one kingdom but all of them together, for the weather does not respect borders. A drought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean would afflict the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, and the cities of the Levant, all at the same time, so that they could not help one another. So that the very connectedness that had been their strength in good times became useless in bad, because everyone was starving at once, and there was no longer anywhere to send for grain, because everywhere the grain had failed together. There is another quiet killer we should not overlook, one that leaves even less trace in the record than drought, and yet may have stalked that crowded. Connected world with terrible effect, disease. The very connectedness that carried goods and letters across the Bronze Age world could also carry sickness. For where ships and merchants and armies move freely from port to port and land to land, so too do the invisible seeds of pestilence, borne along the trade routes as surely as the tin and the grain. A densely connected world is a world in which a plague, once started, can spread far and wide, leaping from city to city along the paths of commerce, striking populations that have no defense against it. And we know that plague was no stranger to that age. The records of the Hittites, in particular, preserve the memory of a terrible pestilence that ravaged their land for years, carrying off great numbers of their people, a disaster so grievous that their kings composed long and anguished prayers to the gods, begging to know what sin had brought the plague upon them, and pleading for it to be lifted. Imagine what a great plague would mean, falling upon a world already reeling from drought and famine, and the first stirrings of war. A population weakened by hunger is a population all the more vulnerable to disease, for the starving sicken more easily and die more readily than the well-fed. And a land emptied by plague is a land that cannot defend its walls, or work its fields, or keep its trade alive, or maintain the complex machinery of its palaces. The dead do not sow the harvest, or man the ramparts, or ply the ships. A severe enough pestilence could hollow out a kingdom from within, leaving its cities half empty, its armies thinned, its whole society too weakened and too few to carry on as before. We cannot measure, at this distance, how great a part disease played in the collapse. It is, like so much else, a matter of fragments and inference. But it belongs among the suspects, this silent and invisible enemy. One more pressure among the many that bore down upon that world in its final years. One more weight added to a burden that was already growing too heavy to bear. And it fits the deep pattern of the whole catastrophe. A threat made worse by connection. A danger that struck not one kingdom, but many, spreading along the very ties that had bound the world together in its days of glory. There is yet another force we must consider, one that came not from the sea or the sky or the trembling earth, but from within the Bronze Age societies themselves. For it may be that these great palace civilizations carried within them the seeds of their own undoing, and that when the pressures mounted, they cracked not only from the blows without, but from the strains within, from the anger and the desperation of their own people. Remember how these societies were built, around the great central palaces, with their storerooms and their scribes, gathering in the wealth of the land and doling it back out again, holding a vast and complicated system together from the top. Remember how much depended on the center, and how little independent life there was beneath it. Such a system can be marvelously efficient in good times, but it asks a great deal of the ordinary people who labor at its base, the farmers and the herders and the craftsmen whose work fills the storerooms, and who receive back only what the palace chooses to give them. Now imagine that system under the pressure of a great drought and a rising tide of raiders. The harvests fail. The storerooms grow empty. The palace can no longer provide. And yet the palace still demands, still requires its people to labor, still takes what little there is, while the elite at the top cling to their comforts and their privileges even as the people below them begin to starve. How long would the loyalty of the common people last under such conditions? How long before the farmers, seeing their families go hungry while they toiled to fill the granaries of a palace that no longer fed them, began to wonder why they should go on obeying at all? There are hints in the wreckage of that world that some of the destruction may have come from within, that some palaces may have been attacked and burned not only by foreign raiders, but by their own people, rising up at last against a system that had failed them, casting off the whole apparatus of palace and king and scribe that had ruled their lives and that could no longer justify its demands. We cannot be certain of this, for rebellion, like drought, leaves an ambiguous record. A burned palace does not always tell us whose hand set the fire, but it fits, disturbingly well, with the deeper pattern of the collapse. For notice what did not come back after the fall. It was not merely the buildings that vanished, but the whole system, the palaces, the kings, the scribes, the redistributive economy, the very art of writing that had served the palace bureaucracy. When the Mycenaean palaces fell, the writing fell with them, and did not return to Greece for centuries. Because the writing had existed only to serve the palace, and once the palace was gone, no one needed it, or wanted it, anymore, this suggests that what collapsed was not just a set of cities, but a whole way of organizing human life, and that its passing may not have been mourned by everyone. For some, perhaps for many, the fall of the palace may have felt less like the end of the world than like a liberation, the throwing off of a heavy and demanding yoke. The common people did not vanish in the collapse. They endured, in smaller and poorer communities, in a simpler and more scattered way of life. It was the top of the society that vanished. The palaces and the elites and the whole grand structure they had built, swept away in the storm, never to return. And whether they were pulled down from without or pushed over from within, or, most likely, both at once, the result was the same. The great centralized order of the Bronze Age was gone, and with it went the brilliance, and the wealth, and the connectedness, and the writing, and so much else that had made that world what it was. There is one more thread we must follow before we gather them all together, and it may be the thread that binds the whole tangle into a single knot, for it runs through every other cause we have named: the collapse of trade itself, the breaking of the very connections that had made the Bronze Age world one world. Remember how utterly that world depended on the long-distance movement of goods, and above all on the flow of tin, without which no bronze could be made. Remember that this trade depended on safe seas and open roads, on the smooth working of 100 harbors and marketplaces, on the confidence of merchants that their ships would arrive, and their goods would sell, and their partners in distant ports would still be there to receive them. All of that was a delicate thing, far more delicate than it looked, held together by peace and prosperity and trust, and it could be unraveled with terrible speed once those conditions failed. And fail they did. As the drought bit and the famine spread, and the raiders began to prowl the seas, the great trade network of the Bronze Age began to come apart. Ships that once sailed freely from port to port now risked plunder, or found their destinations in ruins. Merchants who once ranged across the whole sea drew back, or ceased their voyages altogether. Harbors that had bustled with the traffic of the world fell quiet, and as the trade faltered, the effects rippled outward through every kingdom that depended on it. The tin grew scarce, and bronze grew dear, and the armies that needed weapons and the farmers that needed tools felt the pinch. The luxury goods that had adorned the palaces and sealed the alliances of kings stopped arriving. The grain that had been shipped from lands of plenty to lands of famine could no longer move, because the ships no longer sailed, or because there was no longer any land of plenty to send it. And here we see, with terrible clarity, how the great strength of that world became its fatal weakness. Because everything was connected, the failure of trade did not stay in one place. It spread everywhere at once, along the very same routes that had once carried wealth, so that the arteries that had brought life to the whole system now carried, instead, the contagion of its collapse. Think of it as a great web, glittering and vast, each strand a trade route, each knot a city, the whole thing humming with the ceaseless movement of goods and people and wealth. In good times, that web was a marvel, carrying prosperity to every corner, binding the whole world into one. But cut enough of the strands, and the whole web begins to sag and tear. Each broken strand puts more strain on the others. Each fallen knot leaves its neighbors more exposed, and the tearing, once begun, accelerates, spreading from strand to strand faster and faster, until the whole shining web, so strong and so beautiful, collapses into a tangle of broken threads. That is very nearly what happened to the Bronze Age world. The web of its trade and its connection, which had been the source of all its wealth and all its glory, tore itself apart in a cascade of failures, each one triggering the next, until the whole vast system that had bound the world together simply ceased to exist, and every kingdom that had depended on it was left alone, isolated, cut off, to face its troubles without the help of the neighbors it could no longer reach. And so we come to the heart of the matter, and to the answer that most scholars now believe comes closest to the truth. For a long time, people searched for a single cause of the collapse, one great villain to blame: the sea peoples, or the earthquakes, or the drought, or rebellion. Each theory had its champions, and each seemed for a while to explain the disaster. But the more we have learned, the clearer it has become that no single cause can bear the weight of what happened. The sea peoples alone cannot explain it, for they were themselves, most likely, refugees from a world already in crisis. The earthquakes alone cannot explain it, for cities had always been rebuilt after earthquakes before. The drought alone cannot explain it, nor rebellion alone, nor the cutting of the trade routes alone. Each of these, by itself, the Bronze Age world had faced before, and weathered, and survived. What was different this time, what was catastrophic this time, was that they all came together, at once, or nearly so, piling one upon another, in a single terrible convergence, a perfect storm of catastrophes that no society, however rich, could have hoped to survive. Picture it now, the whole grim sequence, feeding upon itself. A great drought grips the land, year after year, and the harvests fail, and famine spreads. The hungry are driven from their homes, and whole peoples begin to move, becoming migrants, becoming raiders, falling upon the lands that still have food. The trade routes, already strained, are cut by the raiding and the chaos, and the precious tin stops flowing, and bronze grows scarce, and the armies that depended on it are weakened. The earth shakes, and the walls fall, and the cities lie broken and vulnerable just as the raiders arrive. The palaces, unable to feed their people or defend their walls, lose the loyalty of those below them, and some are pulled down by rebellion from within, even as others are stormed from without. And each of these disasters makes all the others worse. The famine drives the migration. The migration cuts the trade. The broken trade deepens the scarcity. The scarcity feeds the unrest. The unrest weakens the defense. The weakened defense invites the raiders. And round it goes. A spiral of catastrophe, each turn dragging the whole world further down, until the entire interconnected system, so brilliant, so wealthy, so seemingly permanent, simply comes apart at every seam at once and collapses into ruin. This is what scholars call a system's collapse, and it is the key to understanding the fall of the Bronze Age. The very thing that had made that world so great, its dense interconnection, the way its parts were bound together into a single system, was also, in the end, the thing that doomed it. For a highly connected system is efficient and rich and powerful in good times, but it is also terribly fragile, because its parts depend upon one another so completely that a failure in one place can cascade through the whole. When each kingdom depends on trade with the others, and each depends on the long-distance flow of tin, and each depends on the smooth working of a great central palace, then the whole edifice is only as strong as its weakest link, and a series of shocks striking many links at once can bring the entire structure crashing down in a way that no single, isolated kingdom would ever have collapsed. The Bronze Age world did not fall because it was weak. In a sense, it fell because it was strong. because it was so tightly and so brilliantly interconnected that it had become one single thing. And when that one thing was struck hard enough, in enough places, all at once, it did not bend. It broke. And it broke everywhere together. There is a lesson in this that has not been lost on those who study the collapse, a lesson that reaches uncomfortably across the 3,000 years that separate that world from our own. For we, too, live in a world of dense interconnection, a world bound together by long and complicated chains of trade, dependent on the smooth flow of goods and resources across vast distances, organized into great and complex systems that few of us fully understand, and that none of us could easily do without. Our world, like theirs, is rich and powerful and interconnected as never before. And our world, like theirs, may be more fragile than it appears, more vulnerable than we like to think to the kind of convergence of shocks, of climate and disruption and disaster that once brought down a civilization that believed itself eternal. This is not to say that we are doomed to the same fate, for we understand our world in ways that they could not understand theirs, and understanding is itself a kind of protection. But the fall of the Bronze Age stands as a quiet warning across the ages, a reminder that no civilization, however great, is beyond the reach of ruin, and that the very things that make a world strong can also, in the wrong moment, become the channels through which its strength drains away. Let us turn now to consider what was lost in the Great Collapse, for the scale of the loss is difficult to grasp, and it is only when we feel its weight that we understand why this catastrophe echoes so hauntingly down the ages. When the Bronze Age world fell, it did not simply exchange one set of rulers for another, as so often happens in history when an empire falls and another rises to take its place. This was something deeper and more terrible. The collapse of a whole civilization, the sinking of an entire way of life into darkness, and the long, poor, silent age that followed is rightly called a dark age. For the light that had shone so brightly went very nearly out. Consider what vanished. The great palaces were gone, and were never rebuilt. The kings and their courts were gone. The vast networks of long-distance trade were shattered, and the ships that had carried the wealth of the world from port to port sailed no more, or sailed only in a diminished trickle. The fine crafts of the palace workshops, the skilled making of luxury goods, the working of gold and ivory and glass, declined or disappeared, for there were no longer any palaces to commission them, or any wealthy courts to buy them. And most strikingly of all, in many places, the art of writing itself was lost. In Greece, the script of the Mycenaean palaces vanished utterly, and for hundreds of years the Greeks were an illiterate people, unable to write at all, their earlier knowledge of writing forgotten so completely that when they at last learned to write again, centuries later, they had to begin afresh, borrowing a wholly new system from others. Think of what that means. A people who could once write, who kept careful records and accounts, forgetting the very art of writing, sinking back into a world of memory and speech alone, so thoroughly that the skill had to be learned all over again from the beginning. That is the measure of how deep the darkness went. The population fell too, and in some regions it fell catastrophically. The great cities shrank to villages, or were abandoned altogether. Whole landscapes that had once been dotted with thriving towns fell silent and empty. People died in the famines and the wars, or fled to other lands, or scattered into smaller and poorer settlements, scraping a harder living from the land in a world that had lost the wealth and the organization and the security of the age before. The grand, connected, cosmopolitan world of the great kings gave way to a fragmented world of small and isolated communities, poorer, simpler, more inward-looking, cut off from the wide horizons that the Bronze Age had known. It was as if a great and brilliant party had ended, and the lights had gone out, and the guests had scattered into the dark. And the great house where they had gathered had fallen into ruin, and a long, cold, lonely night had settled over everything. And in time, the memory of what had been faded into legend. The later Greeks, living in their diminished world, looked back dimly across the gulf of the Dark Age to the vanished glory of the Bronze Age, and they remembered it only as a distant, golden time of heroes, greater than themselves, who had lived in mighty palaces and performed mighty deeds, and then passed away. The great fortress of Mycenae, its walls built of stones so huge that the later Greeks believed only giants could have raised them, became to them a place of myth and legend. And when, centuries later, the poet Homer sang his great epics of the Trojan War, of the heroes and their gold and their bronze and their proud palaces, he was singing, though he may not have fully known it, of that lost world, the vanished world of the Bronze Age, remembered across the long darkness only in the shimmering, half-mythical glow of legend. The Golden Age had become a fairy tale. The real world that had fallen was so thoroughly lost that its own descendants could remember it only as a dream. To feel just how complete the forgetting was, consider the strange fate of the Hittites, that mighty empire of the Anatolian highlands, one of the two great superpowers of the age, rival to Egypt itself, ruler of a broad dominion for centuries. When the collapse came, the Hittite Empire did not merely decline, or shrink, or fall under new masters. It vanished. Its great capital was abandoned and burned. Its royal line ended. Its records ceased, and the whole vast structure of its power simply dissolved and disappeared, so utterly and so completely that in time, the very memory of it was lost to the world. The empire that had treated as an equal with the pharaohs, that had fought them to a standstill and made peace with them as brothers, was erased so thoroughly from human memory that for thousands of years afterward, almost no one knew that it had ever existed at all. Think of what that means. For the greater part of recorded history, down almost to our own age, the Hittites were essentially unknown, a forgotten people, remembered only in a few scattered and puzzling references in the ancient scriptures, where a people called the Hittites are mentioned here and there, but as a minor folk. A small tribe among many, with no hint of the mighty empire they had once been. Scholars reading those ancient texts had no idea that behind that obscure name lay one of the great powers of the ancient world. The whole empire, its kings, its cities, its wars, its treaties, its thousand gods, had fallen out of human knowledge entirely, buried and forgotten beneath the earth and the centuries. A superpower erased from the memory of humankind as if it had never been. And it was only in modern times, little more than a century ago, that the lost empire was found again. Archaeologists digging in the highlands of Turkey uncovered the ruins of a great and ancient city, and in it, a vast archive of clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, written in a forgotten language and a forgotten script. And when, after long and patient labor, scholars at last learned to read those tablets, an astonishing thing emerged from the silence of 3,000 years, a whole lost empire, rising again into the light, with its kings and its histories and its laws and its letters. An entire vanished superpower restored to human memory after being utterly forgotten for millennia. The Hittites, lost so completely that the world had ceased even to suspect that they had existed, were found again, and took their rightful place once more among the great powers of the ancient world. There is something almost dizzying in that story, and something that brings home, as nothing else can, the sheer depth of the darkness into which the Bronze Age world fell. A great empire can be so thoroughly destroyed, so completely forgotten, that for thousands of years no one even knows it was there. Whole worlds can vanish, not just from the earth, but from memory itself, sinking so deep into the silence of the past that they leave scarcely a ripple on the surface of history. And it makes one wonder, in the quiet of the night, how much else has been lost like that. How many other peoples and kingdoms and stories have vanished so completely that not even a rumor of them remains, sleeping still beneath the earth, forgotten beyond all finding, waiting, perhaps, like the Hittites, for some future hand to lift them back into the light, or waiting perhaps forever, in a silence that will never be broken. And yet, as with every ending, this one too held within it the seeds of new beginnings. And it would be wrong to leave the story only in the darkness. For out of that darkness in time, new things arose that would shape the whole future of the world. The collapse of the Bronze Age was a catastrophe, but it was also, in the long view, a clearing of the ground, a breaking up of the old order that made room for the new, and some of what grew in the ruins would prove more enduring and more world-changing than anything that had fallen. Consider the metal itself. The Bronze Age had depended, as we have seen, on the long and fragile trade in tin, without which no bronze could be made. And when the collapse shattered those trade routes and choked off the flow of tin, the peoples of the region were forced to look for another metal, one that did not depend on such distant and vulnerable supplies. And they found it in iron. Iron ore was far more common than tin, found in many places close to hand. And though iron was harder to work than bronze, requiring higher heat and greater skill, the knowledge of how to smelt and forge it spread and improved in the centuries after the collapse, until iron replaced bronze as the chief metal of tools and weapons. And so, the very disaster that ended the Bronze Age helped to usher in the Iron Age that followed, an age whose metal, drawn from the common earth, would prove far more democratic and far more widely available than the precious bronze of the old palace world. Out of the breaking of the old dependency came a new and more resilient foundation. Consider, too, the great gift of the alphabet. In the Bronze Age, writing had been a difficult and specialized craft, using hundreds of complex signs, mastered only by a small caste of professional scribes in the service of the palaces. But in the centuries after the collapse, among the trading peoples of the Levantine coast, the people we call the Phoenicians, there developed and spread a new and vastly simpler system of writing, an alphabet, using only a couple of dozen simple signs, one for each sound, that could be learned by almost anyone in a short time. This alphabet, simple and powerful and easy to learn, spread across the ancient world, carried by the Phoenician traders, and it became the ancestor of the alphabets used by a great part of humanity ever since, including the very letters in which these words might be written down. Writing, which the collapse had nearly destroyed, was reborn in a new and better form, no longer the guarded secret of a scribal elite, but a tool that could belong to everyone. And in the diminished world that followed the collapse, other new peoples and new powers found room to arise. The Israelites, taking shape in the highlands of Canaan, whose scriptures would one day reshape the spiritual life of much of the world. The Phoenicians, spreading across the Mediterranean and founding colonies far to the west. The Greeks, who would emerge at last from their dark age into a new dawn and go on to lay the foundations of so much of Western thought and art and science. The world that rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age was, in the long run, not poorer, but in some ways richer than the one that had fallen, freer, more widely literate, more open. Its knowledge and its power no longer locked away in a handful of palaces, but spreading outward into the hands of many. The collapse was a death, but it was also, in the fullness of time, a strange and painful kind of birth. But let us leave the great questions and the long consequences for a while, and simply be there, in the quiet after the fall, and let the stillness of that vanished world settle over us as we drift toward sleep. For there is a strange and gentle peace in imagining the aftermath, the long, slow settling of a world into rest, and it is a fitting thing to dwell on at the close of a day. Imagine one of the great cities in the years after its fall. The fires that destroyed it burned out long ago. The smoke has cleared. The raiders, whoever they were, have gone, moved on, or died, or settled somewhere far away. And now the ruined city lies open to the sky, its broken walls standing black and silent against the sunset, its fallen stones scattered where they came to rest, its streets empty and still. The wind moves through the roofless halls where kings once feasted. Grass begins to grow between the paving stones of the great courtyards. A bird builds its nest in the shattered gateway. The painted plaster, once so bright, fades and flakes and falls. And over the buried archive, deep beneath the rubble, lie the clay tablets, hardened in the fire, the last letters and the last accounts of a dead world, waiting in the dark, patient beyond all imagining, for the hands that will lift them out again 3,000 years from now. Season follows season over the silent ruins. The rains come and go. The grass grows tall in summer and dies back in winter, and grows again. Dust drifts in on the wind, and settles and builds, layer upon layer, year upon year, gently burying the fallen stones, softening the sharp edges of the ruin, drawing a blanket of earth slowly over the wreckage of the city. Little by little, over the long centuries, the ruins sink from sight. A mound rises where the city stood, green and rounded, and shepherds graze their flocks upon it, and children play upon it, and no one remembers at last that a great city ever stood there at all, that kings once ruled from that green hill, that a whole brilliant world once had its being in that quiet and forgotten place. The city sleeps beneath the earth, and its story sleeps with it, and the grass grows over all. And there is something almost tender in that long burial, something that softens the horror of the fall into a kind of gentle and final rest. The great catastrophe, so terrible in its moment, gives way at last to peace, to silence, to the slow and patient healing of time, which covers over all wounds in the end, even the deepest, and lays a green and quiet blanket over the ruins of even the greatest of falls. The people who suffered in the collapse are long beyond all suffering now. Their fears and their griefs, so sharp and so real in their day, have faded into the deep stillness of the vanished past, 3,000 years deep, quiet as the tablets in the buried dark. And the world went on, as the world always does, and new cities rose, and new peoples flourished, and the long, slow story of humankind rolled onward, out of the darkness and into new light, as it has always done, and as it always will. Hold that image gently now, as you lie in the dark, the green mound over the buried city, the grass rippling in the evening wind, the deep and ancient peace of a world long since laid to rest. There is no fear in it now, no fire, no terror, only the soft and final quiet of a story fully told and gently ended, sleeping beneath the earth, beneath the wide and starry sky, at rest at last, and at peace. Let us think, for a little while, not of empires and trade routes and systems, but of the ordinary people who lived through the collapse. For behind the vast abstractions of history lie countless individual lives, and it is worth remembering that the fall of the Bronze Age was not only the fall of palaces and kings, but the breaking of a great many ordinary human hearts. Somewhere in that dying world, there was a farmer who watched his fields wither in the drought, year after year, and saw his children grow thin, and did not understand why the rains would not come, and prayed to his gods, and was not answered. Somewhere there was a mother who gathered up her little ones and fled from a burning town in the night, carrying what she could, joining the great sad rivers of refugees that flowed across that broken land, not knowing where she was going, only that she could not stay. Somewhere there was an old scribe who had spent his whole life in the service of a palace, keeping its accounts, proud of his difficult and honored skill, who lived to see that palace burn and his whole world end, and who died, perhaps, wondering what would become of all the careful knowledge he had carried, now that there was no one left who needed it. These people did not know that they were living through one of the great turning points of history. They did not have our long view, our maps and our theories, our comfortable distance of 3,000 years. They knew only their own small piece of the disaster, their own failed harvest, their own burning town, their own hunger and fear and grief and loss. To them, the collapse was not a fascinating historical puzzle to be pondered at leisure. It was the end of everything they had known, the shattering of the only world they had, endured one hard day at a time, without any assurance that things would ever be better, or that anyone in the future would ever know or care that they had lived and suffered at all. And yet here we are, 3,000 years later, in the quiet of the night, thinking of them, holding them for a moment in our minds, these nameless people who lived and struggled and endured through the fall of a world. That is a strange and moving thing, when you consider it. The farmer and the mother and the old scribe are long past all remembering. Not even their names survive. And yet, in a way they are not entirely forgotten, for we are thinking of them now, feeling, however faintly, across the vast gulf of time, some echo of what they must have felt. There is a kind of quiet fellowship in that, a thread of shared humanity stretching back across 3,000 years, connecting us, in this peaceful moment, to those distant people in their hour of trial. They were as real as we are. They loved their children as we love ours. They wanted, as we want, only to live in peace, and to see their families safe, and to grow old in a world that made sense. And when that world came apart around them, they bore it as best they could, with the same courage and the same fear, and the same stubborn will to survive that human beings have always brought to their darkest hours. There is comfort in this thought, of a kind, though it is a solemn one, for it reminds us that human beings have faced the end of their worlds before, many times, and have endured, and have gone on, and have built again out of the ruins. The people of the Bronze Age lived through a catastrophe as complete as any in history, and yet humankind did not end there. Their children, and their children's children, survived, and adapted, and slowly, painfully, built a new world upon the wreckage of the old, a world that would in time surpass anything the Bronze Age had known. The story of the collapse is a story of loss. Yes, terrible loss. But it is also, seen whole, a story of endurance, of the deep resilience of our kind, of the way that life, and hope, and the patient work of rebuilding go on even after the greatest of falls. And that, too, is a thing worth holding on to, as we lie here in the safe and quiet dark, thinking of those distant people, and of the long, unbroken chain of survival and renewal that connects their age to ours. Let us wonder, too, how the people of that age understood what was happening to them. For they had none of our theories of climate and trade and systems, none of our long hindsight, and yet they lived through the catastrophe and must have struggled, in their own way, to make sense of it. And the way they made sense of it, so far as we can tell, was through their gods. To the people of the Bronze Age, the world was governed by divine powers, by the great gods of storm and sun and earth and harvest, who sent the rain and ripened the grain and gave victory in battle, and who, when they were angry, could withhold their gifts and loose their wrath upon the world. And so, when the rains failed, and the plagues came, and the enemies gathered, and the cities burned, the people did not think of shifting weather patterns or failing trade networks. They thought, surely, that their gods had turned against them. They thought that they must have sinned, that they had offended the powers that ruled the world, that the catastrophe falling upon them was a punishment, a sign of divine anger, a judgment. We can hear something of this in the prayers that survive from those years, the anguished pleas of kings and peoples begging their gods to tell them what they had done wrong, to reveal the sin that had brought such suffering upon them, to relent, to forgive, to lift the disaster and restore the world to what it had been. Imagine the priests in the failing temples, offering sacrifice after sacrifice, searching for the omens, straining to understand what the gods demanded, as the harvests failed, and the people starved, and the enemy drew near. Imagine the ordinary people, watching their world come apart, and believing with all their hearts that the very heavens had turned against them, that the gods who had always protected them had, for some reason they could not fathom, abandoned them to ruin. What terror that must have been, and what despair, to feel not only that disaster had come, but that the divine order of the universe itself had broken, that the powers who governed all things had withdrawn their favor, that there was no longer anyone, in heaven or on earth, to whom one could turn for help, There is a deep pathos in this, in the thought of a whole world trying, and failing, to understand its own destruction, reaching out to gods who did not answer, searching for a sin to explain a suffering that had, in truth, no such cause, that arose instead from the blind convergence of drought and disease and disruption, from forces that no prayer could touch and no sacrifice could turn aside. They looked for meaning in their catastrophe, as human beings always do, and they found only silence and the slow closing of the dark. And yet there is something to honor, too, in that reaching, in the refusal to accept that the suffering was meaningless, in the human insistence on searching for sense even in the heart of ruin. It is what we have always done. In the face of disasters we cannot understand or control, we look for meaning. We look for reasons. We look for something larger than ourselves to appeal to. The people of the Bronze Age did it in the language of their gods. We do it in the language of our science and our history, but the impulse is the same old human need to understand, to make sense of the world, even when the world seems to be ending. And across 3,000 years, that shared need binds us to them, those distant sufferers, who looked up at the same sky we look up at now, and asked it, as we still ask it, why. It is worth pausing, too, to marvel at the simple fact that we know any of this at all. For the recovery of the story of the Bronze Age collapse is itself a quiet wonder, a testament to the patience and the ingenuity of those who have devoted their lives to piecing together the deep past. For 3,000 years, the fallen world lay buried and forgotten beneath its green mounds and its drifting sands, its cities lost, its kings unremembered, its very languages fallen silent, unread and unreadable. And yet slowly, over the last century and more, that lost world has been coaxed back into the light, fragment by fragment, clue by patient clue, until we can now tell its story, and even argue about its ending, as though it were a thing that happened in the memory of our own grandparents. Think of all that had to happen for us to know what we know. Someone had to dig into the silent mounds and recognize the buried cities for what they were. Someone had to find the clay tablets in the ashes in the ovens, and then, over long years of painstaking effort, learn to read the forgotten scripts and dead languages in which they were written, deciphering, sign by sign, the accounts and the letters of a world that had been mute for millennia, until the voices of the dead could speak again. Someone had to study the layers of ash in the ruins, and read in them the story of the fires. Someone had to drill into the beds of ancient lakes and read the record of vanished rains, in the pollen of long-dead plants. Someone had to dive to the sunken shipwreck on the seabed, and bring up its cargo, and understand what it meant. Piece by piece, from 1,000 scattered sources, across many lifetimes of devoted labor, the great puzzle has been assembled, until out of the silence and the darkness a whole vanished world has risen again, dimly but truly, into the light of our understanding. And it is right to be humble, too, about the limits of what we know, for the picture is still far from complete, and much of it remains uncertain, and honest scholars will tell you that there is a great deal about the collapse that we do not understand and may never understand. We cannot be sure of the exact sequence of events, or the precise weight to give to each of the many causes, or the true identity of the sea peoples, or 100 other things. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered, ambiguous, and it can often be read in more than one way. We are like people trying to reconstruct a vast and complicated story from a handful of torn and scattered pages, filling in the great gaps between them as best we can with reason and imagination, always aware that new discoveries might overturn what we thought we knew. And there is no shame in this uncertainty. Indeed, there is a kind of honesty and beauty in it, in the willingness to say plainly that we do not know for certain, that the mystery is not fully solved, that the deep past keeps many of its secrets still. For in the end, the fall of the Bronze Age remains, and perhaps always will remain, partly a mystery, a great dark question at the dawn of recorded history, into which we can peer only dimly, catching glimpses, forming theories, piecing together fragments, but never quite seeing the whole. And there is something fitting in that, something that suits the vastness and the strangeness of the event itself. A whole world fell, 3,000 years ago, in fire and famine and darkness. And though we have learned a great deal about how and why, the full truth of it lies beyond our reach, buried too deep in time, guarded by too many centuries of silence. We can light a small lamp and hold it up to the darkness, and see a little way into it, and that little is precious and hard-won and real. But the darkness stretches away beyond the reach of our small light, into depths we cannot fathom. And there, in that deep and ancient dark, the last secrets of the fallen world sleep on, undisturbed, as they have slept for 3,000 years, and as they may sleep forever. As our long journey through this ancient story begins to draw toward its close, let your thoughts grow softer and slower, and let us turn, gently, from the details of the fall to the deeper things it has to teach us about the long, slow turning of the world. For there is a strange consolation to be found in a story like this one, a consolation that has to do with the vastness of time, and with our own small and fleeting place within it. When we contemplate the rise and fall of a whole civilization, 3,000 years gone, we are lifted, for a moment, out of the narrow present, out of the small worries and urgencies of our own day, and set down in the great slow current of the ages, where things look very different than they do up close. For here is a truth that the fall of the Bronze Age teaches, quietly but unmistakably, that everything rises, and everything falls, and everything passes in its time. The great powers of that age believed themselves eternal, as great powers always do. The palaces seemed as permanent as the hills. The trade routes and the alliances and the whole glittering order of things had stood for centuries, and seemed as though they must stand forever. And yet they passed, all of them, swept away in a single generation, gone so completely that their own descendants remembered them only as legend. And this same story has repeated itself, again and again, all through the long history of humankind. The rise of a great civilization, its golden age, its long confidence, and then, sooner or later, its decline and fall, and the rise of something new from its ashes. Empires that seemed eternal have crumbled into dust. Cities that ruled the world have fallen silent. The mighty of every age have been laid low in their turn, and forgotten, and replaced. It is the deepest and most constant rhythm of history, this endless turning of the wheel, this rising and falling and rising again. And it has never once stopped, in all the long ages of the world. There is a sadness in this, of course, but there is also, if we let it be, a strange and profound peace. For if everything passes, then our own troubles, too, will pass. If even the greatest of civilizations must one day fall, then perhaps we can hold our own worries a little more lightly, seeing them for what they are. Small and fleeting things in the great sweep of time. The people of the Bronze Age carried their anxieties as heavily as we carry ours. Their fears felt as real and as pressing to them as ours do to us. And all of it is past, long ago, faded into the deep silence of the past, so utterly that we do not even know their names. And one day, in the fullness of time, our age too will pass, and our worries with it, and be forgotten in their turn, and the great wheel will go on turning, as it always has, long after we and everything we know have become, ourselves, a chapter in some far-off story, or a layer of ash in the earth, or a green mound beneath a wide and starry sky. This is not a bleak thought, though it may sound like one. It is, rather, a liberating one if we let it be, and a deeply peaceful one. For it places us within something vast and enduring, the great unbroken chain of human life stretching back to the Bronze Age and far beyond, and forward beyond anything we can see, a chain of countless generations, each rising and living and passing in its turn, each handing on the gift of life and knowledge and hope to the ones who come after. We are one link in that immense chain, one brief life among the countless billions. And there is a deep comfort in belonging to something so much larger and older and more enduring than ourselves. The Bronze Age fell, but humankind went on, and humankind will go on still, through whatever rises and whatever falls, carried forward by that same deep resilience, that same stubborn hope, that same unbreakable will to live and to build and to begin again, that has carried it through every darkness since the world began. And you are part of that. And so was the farmer in his withering field, and the mother fleeing in the night, and the old scribe with his forgotten skill, 3,000 years ago. All of us together, one great and unbroken company, moving through the long night of time toward a dawn we cannot see. And now the long story is very nearly told, and it is time to let it all come gently to rest, and to let yourself come to rest along with it. So let your mind begin to release the details now, the way you loosen your grip on the cares of the day as sleep draws near. Let the theories and the dates and the arguments blur softly together and drift away. You need hold on to none of it. Let the sea peoples fade back into the mist from which they came. Let the earthquake still, and the fires die down, and the anxious letters settle into the quiet of the ovens where they lay for 3,000 years. There is nothing here you must carry with you. Keep only, if you keep anything, the feeling of the thing, the vastness of it, the strangeness, the deep and ancient peace that lies over it all now, so many centuries later. Let your thoughts go back, one last time, to where we began, to that warm afternoon on the stone quay of the great harbor, in the last bright days before the fall. Stand there again now, in your mind, in the golden light. The sea stretches away before you, deep and blue and calm, all the way to the hazy horizon, and the wind is soft and warm upon your face. And it carries the smell of salt and cedar in far-off places. The ships move slowly across the water, their square sails filled with the gentle wind, and behind you the rich city climbs the hill, busy and content, and the palace crowns the height, its painted walls glowing in the late sun. The longshoremen work unhurried on the quay. The merchants call to one another in their many tongues. A scribe sits in the shade, making his careful marks upon the clay. And over all of it lies the warm and drowsy peace of a world at its ease, a world that does not know, and need not know, what is coming. A world simply being itself, in the golden light of an afternoon 3,000 years ago. Let that be the image you carry down into sleep. Not the fall, not the fire, not the darkness, but this, the golden harbor, the calm blue sea, the ships upon the water, the whole rich and connected world, going quietly about its business, in the warm light of a perfect afternoon. It was real. It happened. For long and lovely centuries, that world lived and flourished beside that ancient sea, and its people loved their lives and their children and their golden afternoons as much as we love ours. And though it fell, though it passed away into fire and legend, still it was, and the fact that it was is a kind of quiet gift, handed down across 3,000 years, to us, here, now, in the stillness of this night. And perhaps there is a gentleness in that for you, as you lie here in the dark. The great world of the Bronze Age carried its burdens, as we carry ours, and in time it set them down, as in time we will set down ours. The people of that age are all at rest now, every one, their long day over, their cares forgotten, their stories sunk into the deep and peaceful silence of the past. And you, too, may set your burdens down, just for tonight. There is nothing you must solve before you sleep. There is nothing you must carry, and nothing you must fear. The ships are sailing on the calm blue sea. The golden light lies warm upon the water. The long day of that ancient world is done, and the long day of your own day is done as well. And now there is only the quiet, and the dark, and the soft rising tide of rest, coming to gather you up and carry you gently away. So let your breathing slow now, and let it deepen, and let your body grow heavy and warm and still, sinking down into the quiet like a stone settling softly to the bed of a calm sea. There is nothing more to do tonight. The long story is told. The great question has been asked, and answered as well as it can ever be answered. Not with a single cause, but with a gathering of many. A perfect storm long ago, that broke a brilliant world and scattered it into the dark, and then let time draw its green and gentle blanket slowly over the ruins. And there is peace in that answer, once we make our peace with it. The peace of understanding that all things rise and shine and fall in their turn, and that even the deepest darkness gives way, at the last, to a new and quiet dawn. Let the last images of that ancient world grow soft and dim now, and drift away into the deep. The golden harbor, fading gently into evening. The blue sea, its bright shimmer, stilling into calm. The great cities, their fires long cold, sleeping now beneath their green and quiet mounds. The clay tablets in the dark, patient beyond all patience, keeping their long silence. Let it all grow gentle and far away, a beautiful and terrible thing seen once, from a great distance, and now released, the way you release the day itself as you sink toward sleep. There is nothing left to hold. There is nothing left to fear. There is only the quiet, and the warmth, and the slow, soft tide of rest, rising up to carry you away. The ancient sea lies calm beneath the stars, as it has lain through so many thousand nights, washing gently against the shores where the great cities rose and fell so long ago. The green mounds sleep beneath the wide dark sky. The dust drifts slowly down over the buried world, as it has drifted for 3,000 years, and the stars wheel overhead, in their vast and silent turning, the same stars that shone down on the golden harbor, and on the burning cities, and on the long silence that followed, keeping their ancient watch, as they have kept it since long before the first ship ever sailed that sea, and as they will keep it long after we, too, are gone. And you may rest now, as deeply and as peacefully as that ancient world rests beneath its stars and its earth, carried down gently into the dark and the quiet, and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may simply let these words fade and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if ever you find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting. Another vanished world or forgotten age to wander through together in the dark. Until then, from the calm blue sea, and the golden harbor, and the quiet green mounds beneath the ancient stars, I wish you nothing but stillness, and comfort, and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet, and I wish you a calm and peaceful night.